Now, I'm not a utopian. I don't think this happens all the time, and I don't think it happens easily. But it is also true that when systems continue to fail, when pain grows, when more and more people are disillusioned, when they reach the point, very interesting thing was said here, when they reach the point when you know that going door to door to talk to the legislature's lobbying isn't going to do it, that you've got to get out and organize. Those are steps in the kind of slow development of consciousness that are big deals, not small deals. So yes, hey, contributions for that, that's really important, organizing. Yes, do that. But that's a big step. What's happening around the country is, to me, which is part and parcel of what I think your movement is about and my movement is about, is something about capital and ownership. Let me say something strange about that. A public single-payer health system is a socialized public insurance company. That's what it is. It's a government-owned insurance company. I mean, I think we have to go beyond single-payer, and probably a lot of people don't, but that's the big major step. So what does that mean? It means that instead of the insurance companies owning the insurance company, the public owns it. That's what single-payer is. We don't quite formulate it that way. We talk about single-payer, but once you formulate it that way, you begin thinking about, it's about democracy, democratic ownership of a company. It's a strange way of thinking about it. It is a socialized system, if you like. But nonetheless, what it is who gets to own the system gets to control it. And in the case of single payer, that's what you're talking about. And it is the biggest system in the United States that over the next decades has the possibility of being transformed away from the current power sources, the private insurance companies, the private pharmaceutical companies, the private hospital system, to a different system, piecemeal, I think, state by state, by agonizing state by state, but also transforming a major sector in the economy to democratic ownership and control. Now, that's a hard thing to do. And what drives that is pain, and then awareness, and then action, and then thought and strategy. What is really interesting is, if you look at the single-payer process around the country, 22 states are now considering moving in the way that Vermont has moved, slowly, agonizingly, in difficult ways. There are different parts of the economy where precisely the same thing is happening, and alliances are beginning to be thought about around the simple idea of who gets to own this. Is it in the interest of the public, or is it in the interest of the corporations? And not simply trying to regulate the corporations. There's some of my heroes on this subject, you're going to laugh when I say it, are the conservative economists at the University of Chicago who taught Milton Friedman, the great conservative economist, his economics. Huh? That doesn't sound right, does it? Well, the conservative economists in the early Chicago School of Economics understood exactly what we're talking about here. The reason is they actually believed genuinely in a free market economic system where there was genuine competition. And they saw the big corporations as rigging the system against what they genuinely believed in. And some of them, many of them, had great integrity, coming from a different part of the political spectrum from me, but they had integrity about their ideas, and they understood that the big corporations, and we're now talking about insurance companies and pharmaceuticals and hospital chains in this country, rigged the system by using political power. And if you tried to regulate them, watch this is a conservative way of doing it. Genuine conservative. I'm not talking about phonies. Real conservatives, not the guys who just spout rhetoric. If you try to regulate them, these people argue they will take over the regulators. Yep, that's what happens typically. They do take over the regulators because they've got enough power to do that insidiously. Now, the other alternative is you break them up and you get real competition. But then they regroup, like AT&T and Standard Oil, and they're back at the trough. And these conservatives said, you want to deal with this? These are conservatives, free market economists. There is only one option left. make them public. That's the only way to get transparency, control, etc. That is a single-payer health system. And the argument, it seems to me, is irrefutable that that direction is the only direction we could possibly go. Aside from the fact, as you know better than I, that if we do that, probably the cost of health care in the United States could be cut in half. We spend twice, as you know better than I do, we spend twice as much as comparable countries with poorer results. The number that sticks in my mind, were we to achieve what's been done elsewhere around the world regularly, the number is $1 trillion a year. The people know that, but that is an extraordinary amount of money that could be saved were we actually living, and with better outcome results, were we doing what other countries do regularly. $1 trillion a year. I urge you to say that to people, because they don't really get it when you talk about it. That's the number. Nice round number, at least $1 trillion is in balance of what could be done with that. The thing that I began to kind of sketch in this direction is that there's awareness of this basic proposition that somehow we need to change the ownership structure if we're to achieve political outcomes. That has many forms. And as the movement that is developing around the country out of growing pain, out of growing difficulty, continues to deepen, what we're seeing is a whole range of people in different parts of the country reaching a similar conclusion in different ways. So, another form of democratizing ownership is not only public, either state or federal ownership of the healthcare system, it is simply worker co-ops or cooperatives, which is another democratic form of ownership. And they are developing all over the country. What they're developing out of is growing pain, that there is no solution for many, many people. Partly there is a new movement in many parts of the country, I'm going to tell you about several of them that we've seen developing, that also have this characteristic of democratic ownership. Partly it is the new developments, but partly there's an old history in the United States that people are drawing on around this idea that people ought to own the production and the distribution in a different way. And that co-op movement, people tend to forget, 140 million Americans currently already are members of co-ops in one form or another. That's an old tradition. Some are agricultural, some are food co-ops, some are distributional co-ops at hardware stores, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Some are credit unions. Credit unions are another form of this ownership. Now, I need to say a word about credit unions because there's some really interesting things happening with credit unions. Credit union is a one-person, one-vote bank. That's what it is. It's co-op. You can join your credit union, you got one vote just like everybody else. People don't quite think of it that way. They don't see it as part and parcel of the movement to democratize ownership. But the credit unions in the United States, and activists have picked up on this in other parts of the country, and they're part of the larger movement concerned with these changes as well. Credit unions in the United States control $1 trillion in capital. That's more than any one of the big five New York big banks. They're also democratic organizations. You can go to the annual board meeting. You can elect the board. Nobody ever goes. And if you elect the board, you can allocate the funds to help develop other things. And that's beginning to develop in various parts of the country as people realize that it's not simply a movement that has to be built to try to regulate, and not simply to advise the legislatures, would you please vote this way, Mr. or Mrs. No, it means actually transforming who gets to own in a democratic form. That piece is another part of the puzzle. Another thing that's happening, these are all elements that are pointing in the same converging direction that is suggested by single payer, namely, not simply trying to regulate, but attempting to make public the actual ownership of the system in order to get control of the outcomes. That's what single payer is about. The notion is you can't get there from here unless you own it as a public. That's what you folks are into it. But I think it's a general principle that we're beginning to see in many, many parts of the country. And once you see it as a principle, and also that unlike the traditional discussion of this, where that principle became a horrendous state-owned structure like the Soviet Union, Unlike that, there's a very American, down-home way of thinking about this that is very decentralized as well. I mean, I'm from Racine, Wisconsin. In Racine, Wisconsin, we've got co-ops. We've got worker-owned co-ops. We've got old credit unions. We've got agricultural co-ops. It's down-home experience of an American kind that begins to suggest a vision. I use the word suggest. Begins to suggest a vision of where we might go that is both very decentralized, but also begins to change where the power really is, which is in ownership. So a vision that's both decentralized and changes the nature of the structure is something a little bit different from what people have been talking about, and yet it draws on the strengths that we're beginning to see in this country, that we have in this country, and we're beginning to see variations of. Let me give you some other examples of what I'm beginning to talk about. It's called the New Economy movement. I'm sure many of you know about it, but it's bubbling up all over the country, and it's all about this principle that you cannot achieve what you want unless, as you know from the single-payer movement, unless you change the ownership of structure, and better do it in a decentralized way if you want to control it, otherwise it gets too centralized. So here's another one. You probably have noticed in Boulder, Colorado, they took over, the citizens organized a movement to take over the public utility. Why? Because it was pouring pollution into the air, it was creating climate change problems, and they organized enough activity, one by one by one, the same thing Sergio was talking about, and actually won against the utility company. And they're fighting out they won the first battle by a very small number of votes, and then the second battle by a larger number of votes, and they're still going to have to fight. But they actually understood, you want to do it? If you want to do it, by the way, I'm talking to the person in your chair. If you want to do it, that's how it's done, the way Sergio was discussing it. There is no other way. But what I see, you folks wouldn't be here unless you're actually interested in building a movement rather than talking to the legislators. Now, you've got to talk to legislators as well. But that is the nature of what's happening. I mean, I'll give you another example. We're seeing this all over the country now, and the press doesn't cover this kind of thing. They don't have any interest. They also don't have any reporters anymore. The newspaper reporters, most newspapers just don't have reporters to cover up what's going on locally. So you really have to dig for it. So I'll give you another one, because we're involved with a very interesting one in Cleveland, Ohio. Now this is coming out of pain levels, but it's part of the movement that we're all building and have to build. The neighborhood I'm going to talk about is 40,000 people, almost entirely black, unemployment rate 40%. Just let that sink in, 40%. Average income less than $20,000 per family, okay? You got the picture. In the middle of that neighborhood are major institutions. The Cleveland Clinic, world famous institution, University Hospitals, Case Western Reserve University, right in the middle of that area. Those institutions, you can think about Johns Hopkins while I'm talking about Cleveland. Those institutions purchase $3 billion, with a B, not an M, dollars in goods and services a year. Now, let's leaving aside the construction, that's much more over here, and leaving aside their salaries, just what they buy. None of it from this area. 40,000 people, 40% unemployment, average family income under 20,000. So a light bulb went on. We're not going to get anywhere lobbying. We're going to set up worker-owned cooperatives, sophisticated worker-owned cooperatives, not little dinky ones. We're going to link them together with a nonprofit corporation, so we're not just making some, if we're successful, some workers, quote, rich, not rich, but helping them. We're trying to build the community so that the nonprofit will support the community. The worker-owned cooperatives are sort of hang off of the nonprofit. And then there's a revolving fund so that if you make some money, we're going to set up another one. And also get those hospitals and universities to buy from this structure. So we really begin to build, change who owns, change participation, and also use the system and have leverage on it to begin moving towards a different systemic design. Let me say it again. The systemic design is eerily in the same direction as a public corporation owning the health system, insurance system. It is a system based on changing ownership, democratizing, making it responsible to the community, and in this case, we ought to talk about this more, developing a participatory mechanism within the structures of the worker-owned companies or within the structures of the healthcare system as well. That's a whole other dimension that has to be included. So in the Cleveland, so-called the Evergreen model, because they call themselves the Evergreen Cooperatives, the Cleveland models now are underway, and I mentioned they're not just little ones. The largest industrial scale greenhouse in the United States is one of these co-ops. It produces 3 million heads of lettuce a year. It's that scale. They're trying to change something, not to do, you got to start where you can start, but they're trying to move the ball to a different level, and in that environment, much more difficult than what most of us face, they are raising the level of their aspiration and their sense of who they are to ask, can we change the system? Now, I am suggesting to the person in your chair and in my chair that that is what it's about. It isn't about them. It's not about the insurance companies, and it's not about the hospitals. It's about whether we actually understand the nature of what it is required to do by us. I'm less interested in them out there than I am in how we actually rise to the level of thinking through what it will take to do what's necessary. That's something we can control. They can control other things. But that's something people like the people in this room, and I suspect most of you are way ahead of me on this stuff, that's our challenge personally, as well as a movement, to actually look squarely at this power system and say, that has to be changed. May take a couple of decades, may take a lot of hard work. Lots of people have done it before. That's what we're going to do. I sometimes tease, you want to play this game? The chips are a couple of decades of your life. That's okay, that's the name of the game. Throw them on the table and, ante up and let's go. No other way to do it. So, but there are models out there that tell you what can be done. I mentioned Cleveland, I mentioned Boulder, but by the way, there are 100 cities now have said, hey, what's going on over there in Cleveland? Maybe we could do it here. Several of them are well underway. Cincinnati's way underway. Atlanta's underway. Jackson, Mississippi is really interesting. Jacksonville, Florida as well. They've said, looked around and said, hey, if we can do it there, maybe we can actually do it here. You guys are doing the same thing. Look at Vermont. Maybe we can do what Vermont does. If people begin to do what is necessary, other people take heart from it and begin to say, we could do that too. Many other things going on around the country that I'm not going to go on and on about this, but we're seeing it because at the university we've been studying it and we've been trying to help build some. We helped with the Cleveland model, this Evergreen models. Our team was involved working with this group. But we kind of try to keep an eye on what's going on. So some of you want to follow this, I'll give you a couple of websites. One is called community-wealth.org. Put the dash in because there's one without community, without a dash. And this just surveys, as best we can, many kinds of forms of what's going on. Worker co-ops are popping up everywhere. Land trusts are popping up. Now here's part of the progression. I want to give you a sense of the progression that's also involved in this. It's not only when one person does it or one group does it, then other people say, hey, we can do that. It's also that over time, people get more and more sophisticated about it. We are beginning to see people develop new strategies out of pain and out of frustration, out of anger and out of hope. That's what we're seeing out in the country that isn't being reported. That's what you guys are doing when you see the work co-ops developing. What you see, I was just at Red Emma's, it's beautiful, the development over the last 8 years of that organization. And what you're doing here, reaching the level of now we've got to take this whole thing to a different level with organizing and changing. That process, difficult, painful, first changing awareness, but also changing developmental strategies, and beginning to think not abstractly, but very concretely, what would it actually mean if we were to take ourselves really seriously and to say that we together are in the process of building a movement to transform the most powerful political economic system in the history of the world. Not rhetorically. I mean, really. Now, what I heard you guys before I got up here to talk, and you know what free talk is about, what don't bother, is that's what you're doing. What I see you doing is in the process of saying, hey, we've got to do something different in the way of organizing, we've got to change what we're about, and we've got to be part of a national movement that may be the 20 states, from Vermont first, and maybe we'll be second or third or fourth, and join with others in this state and around the country who are doing worker co-ops and land trusts and green part. There's a whole green part of this as well. There's an ecological movement that's part of this new economy development, whatever is emerging. That this is a process, it's a very normal process. Very ordinary. Very heroic, but very ordinary, that when things get worse, people either wake up and say, nobody else can do this but us. Who, me? Who else? Look in the mirror in the morning. I suggest this to you, learn this from a radical organizer once. Just look in the mirror in the morning and say, who, me? Who else? So, that's part of the sermon. I'm getting away from that part of it. The reason I think this is the most interesting period in American history that we happen to be living into, I've given you some sketch, that the era we're entering is saying the old ways really don't work. We got away with it with the boom, and we got away with it with the depression, and something aberrant happened, but we are now entering a period where it's probably no easy way kind of getting in the way of the fact that either you develop something new and change the system, or it gets worse. Now, as you may have noticed, I'm talking about changing the system in a kind of different way than some people talk about it. I'm talking about it in a kind of, what I think of as an American kind of emergent form. There's a whole Marxist theory that the system is to collapse and there'll be a revolution. I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's going to stagnate and decay. And besides, if there was a great collapse, it'd probably go to the right rather than the left. So I don't think that's right. And I don't think we're going to get a liberal solution of the kind that I used to run House and Senate staffs on. Labor movements all over the world have collapsed, and that was the heart of that movement. What I think we're into is a different process. And we have to, I have a name for it, but we need a better name. It's one in which there's growing awareness, but also growing development, and an evolving, changing transformation, including transforming how the ownership of the system is structured. In this case, single payer is one form of it. The worker co-ops in Cleveland are another form of it. The land trusts are another form of it. The municipal ownership is another form of it. It is a pluralist form of evolving, an evolutionary transformation that also challenges as it goes. We'll see. That's a possibility. That's, something you may or may not want to bet your life on. That is what the process of organizing is about. But that's the kind of process that may set us up step by step for a larger change at some point. I'm going to say 2 or 3 more words. Don't trust me if I say that, because I'll probably say a little more. But 2 or 3 more things that at least give me perspective on it, the way I think about it. The way the American system, and now I speak as a historian, some other historians would challenge me for sure. The way the American system was run successfully in the 19th century was pretty simple. You had an empty continent except for all those people who lived here. And you had a lot of fertile land. None of the other countries had that, by the way. Just think about that. Very unusual, extremely unusual. And when you got into trouble with the economic system, all you had to do is kind of take more land and kick the people off. You could do that for a whole century. And then you got to the Pacific Ocean, and then you got a new problem. So just a shorthand way of saying they ran the system by taking over the continent, step by step when they got into trouble. In the 20th century, all too simple, every time you got into trouble, you solve the problem with a war. I don't mean they created wars to solve the problem. I don't think that's true. I don't believe in conspiracies. But World War I did, in fact, solve the problem when there's a major recession, and World War II pulled us out of the Depression, and the post-war boom was the Korean War, the Cold War, Vietnam War, et cetera, it stabilized the economy. We're running out of war, and that's a good thing. We're not going to solve the problems. And the military budget, large as it is down to 3% of the economy. It's going down further. It's in that range now. So we're not solving the problems by taking land, and we're not solving the problems by going to big wars like the Continental War, which means that the issues are going to deepen right before us because the traditional solutions aren't available. That's a really interesting part of history. That's a period when disillusionment grows slowly, and people, a lot of right-wing stuff too, begin to say either something different is going to happen or it gets worse. And either we do something different or it gets worse. Or either I do something different and it gets worse. So, you probably didn't, I am in the kind of church, I guess. You probably didn't think I was going to go in this direction, but when I hear what you folks are beginning to struggle with, and the healthcare system is 20% of the 18% of the GDP, it is a big component of it. Taking that on directly as you are doing seems to me a central piece of what has to be done, and what can be done if you say, where are we going over the next decade or two, and how do we organize with other parts of this movement that is moving in the same kind of chaotic, slow, reaching conclusions in different parts of the economy, that something has to happen that is not trying to regulate, not trying to just pass bills, but changes actually in a democratic form who gets to own this stuff. That, I think, is the possibility that's right before us in this era and at this time. So I'll say one more thing and then I'll sit down. You probably had enough of this. The one way I think about it, and my heroes, and I happened to work a little bit with Dr. King when I was younger, much younger, and I was a great admirer of what they did, and what he did, and also what the SNCC people did. And a lot of people did different things in the civil rights movement. Probably a lot here know about that. But my heroes are not the civil rights workers of the 1960s. They are my heroes, but the ones I really take my hat off to, and think about this, they're the people in Mississippi in the 1930s and 40s who laid the groundwork when it was really hard to do, upon which the successful civil rights movement built, and without which they could not have built. Those are the ones, and facing murder, facing being killed, all the terrible things, but those were the people who actually established the conditions in a very hard time. And the same thing is true of the women's movement and the environmental movement. If you actually look in the prehistory of what we call the movements, it's very easy to join a movement when the movement's moving. That's no problem. Hey, that's fun actually, a lot of fun. The real work is laying the groundwork for the transformative possibility that comes thereafter. And from what I've heard here, that's what I think you guys are trying to do, and that's why this is the place I want to be. Thank you very much.